Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure. I'm James Orbinski. I'm the director of the Dahdaleh Institute for Global Health Research here at York University. And it is my pleasure today to, let me just close the windows because it actually affects the acoustics. It's my pleasure today to welcome Chris Houston, who will be giving our graduate seminar on war, humanitarianism, and why the Canadian Peace Museum. And that will serve as a background to the PhD seminar, which will follow, where we will be specifically and critically looking at the issue of the laws of war in relationship to global health and humanitarianism. But before we go in that direction, I'd like to just begin with a land acknowledgement, and following which I'll give you a little bit of background on Chris, and then we'll turn over to Chris. I'd just like to acknowledge that the land we are on here at York University campus in Toronto is the traditional territory that is known as Tekaronto. And I'd also like to acknowledge its treaty holders, which are the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And also, I would like to acknowledge that this is the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, which include the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis people. And this territory, is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I'd just like to emphasize the word peaceably and the word share and the word care. And I think those three words are particularly germane to what Chris is going to talk about today. Chris Houston is a longtime dear friend, I have to say, who has worked internationally with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, for many, many years. He's also worked with the Canadian Red Cross and with the World Health Organization and with the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation, I believe. And also with Grand Challenges Canada, where he led the emergence, the creation, the genesis, whatever you want to say, the beginning of the humanitarian Grand Challenge, which is actually now, in terms of how Grand Challenges functions, is one of its most successful and truly innovative funded Grand Challenge themes. Chris is also CEO or Chief Executive Officer of Humanitarian Associates, which is a consulting firm. And I always wonder what that means when it says consulting. That's a very general term. Maybe you could tell us what you're consulting about sometime during the presentation.
Sure, I can be to talk about that.
Yeah. And he's also part-time faculty at the University of Toronto Global Health Education Initiative. He's appeared widely around the world in various media settings based on his experience, years of experience in Nigeria, Djibouti, Nepal, Pakistan, many different territory or regions within the Middle East, including Lebanon and Yemen. And Yemen is one particular area where Chris spent a lot of energy and time dealing with a truly horrific and complex situation. Those are just some of the places and regions that Chris has worked in over the years. And based on that experience, and also on his experience with Grand Challenges and some of the other organizations, Red Cross and others that I've talked about, WHO, he's appeared widely internationally on BBC, CBC, CTV News, CNN, on various issues. And he writes regularly for the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, and also he has a regular column in the Bancroft Times, and the column is the Stories of Peace, which I think is weekly. Yeah. And Chris also has vast governance experience at many nonprofit organizations, including MSF and Alima Canada. And he's president of the Canadian Peace Museum charity. He's actually more than president. He's the person who came up with the idea and really has pulled together a group of people to help him build the Canadian Peace Museum. I'm one of them, and I just think it's one of the most beautiful ideas and necessary ideas. And I asked Chris to come and share with us today from his experience of war, of humanitarianism in war, and based on that experience, why answer the question to the best of your ability. Why is the Canadian idea and now the reality of the Canadian Peace Museum, why is that a good thing? So with that, I'll just turn over to you, Chris.
Thank you. You made me blush a little bit.
Well, I noticed you're blushing. I've never seen you blush before. That's very.
I'm going to start with the video. The audio in here is not great, so I'm going to ask you to listen carefully.
On International Day of Peace, Birds Creek Beavers are saying what peace means to them. Peace is calmness, not getting bullied, fun, feeling safe around other people, helping others when they fall, watching a sunset on the lake, being kind, filling someone's bucket.
Peace to me means having friends.
What peace means to me is no war, which is forgiveness, which is kindness, which is peace.
You're outdoor laying on the grass and you see the birds chirping. It's very lovely and beautiful.
It means relaxed, not frazzled, or my mind feels clear and I don't have any worries.
Peace means caring, kindness. Słaszczot avec tout le monde. Be kind with everyone.
And that's a video that we shared at the Stories of Peace Award ceremony almost a year ago in Bancroft. And now, because we had some technical issues, now I'm going to switch to sharing the slides that I had planned. So bear with me for 1 second as I do so.
So I'll just talk while you're doing that. So Bancroft, for those who aren't familiar, is a small town outside of Toronto, about 200 or so kilometers north of Toronto, 220 kilometers north. Very small town, in fact. It's 5,000 people of permanent residents, I believe, that are actually in the town and then in the surrounding county. And then that swells to some, I think it's 50 or 60,000 during the summer at the peak of cottage season, which is a major, there were many people here in this room who are new to Canada, literally in the last few weeks. So I'm just going to sort of say a few things that are kind of really important. In Ontario, it's very common for people to leave Toronto and go to their cottage in the country, in the wild land, as many people might think of it, where people often have small cottages, or some of them are just massive, mansions. But the majority are actually quite small, little household kind of cottages that people go to, very low level services. Many still don't have, washrooms or toilets. They still use outhouses. So this is quite normal and very much part of kind of Toronto Canadian culture, is to have a familiarity and or a place in outside of a major urban setting. And this is a common thing across the country. So not just Toronto, there's 5 main cities in Canada. And each of those cities, outside of those cities, it's very common for people in those cities during the summer to have at least a couple of weeks in what's called cottage country. And it's called cottage country in each of those 5 cities. So it's very much a kind of a cultural mindset. And so Bancroft is a small community in Northern Ontario.
Small but mighty.
Small but mighty. And it's very interesting that the choice to locate the Peace Museum in Bancroft, as opposed to in Toronto or in Ottawa or in Halifax or Montreal or Calgary or Vancouver or even Winnipeg. Hope there's no Winnipeggers here. I didn't mean any disparaging. And my wife is from Winnipeg, so I'm dissolved.
Winnipeg would be a great place for it. It's a rich history of doing good things, you know. I was very impressed when I went.
So over to you.
But-
Just a little back.
So just over a year ago, just under a year ago, I showed that video at the end of this event, and at the start of this event, Professor Wim Levin, and I see that you're online. Wim, it's great to see you here. Spoke. He's a good friend of mine. Wim has a PhD in peace and conflict. And he drove for 7 hours from Ohio to speak. I told him he'd have 2 minutes on the microphone at this event. And I thought, what is a guy who's got a PhD in the very subject going to sum up in 2 minutes? I'm going to quote him because I thought it was quite important. I thought it was important because, 11 and a half months ago, October 2023, felt like quite a difficult time in the world. And so I was honestly nervous about the event, how we could navigate speaking about peace when the world felt so violent. So here's what Professor Wim said. He looked at the room of the audience and he estimated there was about 75 people in the room. And he said, people are about 2 feet wide. And if all 75 people stood in a line, it would be 150 feet wide. And in case you think that war is normal, Professor Levin made the point that if that 150 feet wide represented the entirety of human history, the amount of time in that history that included war would be the width of a human fist, 4 inches. The other 149 feet and 8 inches was peace. And peace is normal. And peace has always been normal. And peace is the norm today. And we're going to speak about conflict, and we're going to speak about the trends in conflict, and they're not good. But it was an important framing for me from Dr. Wim. And I went back to him and I asked him, we explored the 150 feet wide history, and I wrote about that in a column if anybody wants. We can share some information. A lot of these points are covered quite well in this book that I recommend. But peace is normal. But the title of this event is war, so let's just talk about war a little bit. And I finished my slides, well, honestly, I finished them about an hour ago, but I did most of the work last night. And I looked at the website last night, and this was just happened to be, when I'm looking at it, what was the front page and all of the news? It was conflict. Sudan wasn't there, and so that wasn't the front page of Al Jazeera, but I wanted to make sure that Sudan got a mention. But war makes the front page, and I write for a local newspaper, as Dr. James has said. And so I can tell you with a professional experience that what makes the front page is unusual. That's what news is. News is what is unusual. It's not the norm. If it's the norm, it doesn't make the news. Now, depending on which source you use, you'll get different answers to this. I like Our World in Data. It does a lot of good things, but I feel like it gives a slightly too rosy picture of the world with regards to conflict. I prefer this source. Uppsala University in Sweden has a conflict data program, and this is freely available online. You can look at it. What you can see at the bottom of the screen is a graph. The white color there is the total. So let's just focus on that. That's the number of people who die in conflict per year. And this is Rwanda back here in 1994. That's the worst since they've got it on record. But the second worst was the year before last, and last year's numbers aren't looking great, and not all conflict deaths are caught in real time. This doesn't show a good trend. This shows that the number of people dying in conflict is on the rise globally just now. This is the number of conflicts. You're going to see 2 graphs. The first one is the state-based conflict. Government conflict. You don't need to be an expert to see the rising trend. Here we have non-state, still rising. So all from the same source, all from Uppsala. I teach at University of Toronto. I've been teaching for about 12 years. I'm part of the Global Health Education Initiative there, faculty there, and I teach about complex humanitarian emergencies, which is jargon for humanitarian response in conflict. And every year I show this slide. This is just straight off Wikipedia. I find it to be one of the good ways of tracking it. Every year, just before, the few days before I teach, I look at the page that is list of ongoing armed conflicts. Every year, I think every single year, that I update my slide, and every year it's a higher number. They break the conflicts down by number of deaths in the past 365 days. How many people died? So the major wars are places where there's been more than 10,000 deaths. We're up to 6 wars of that magnitude. I've not had that number before. Oh, it's a touchscreen. We live in modern times. We're at 31. Let's call this the wars. These are minor conflicts. The number's 31. I think it's the highest it's ever been. It's not a good trend. James spoke about my time in Yemen, and James will know that I'm quite open about speaking about my post-traumatic stress disorder as a consequence of some of the places that I've worked. That's one of the downsides to spending time in conflict zones. It's a problem that many humanitarian workers have. The upside to my experiences is it gives me a really strong sense of perspective. My accent will make it clear that I'm not born in this country, but I am Canadian. And I love Canada, and I love it for many reasons, and its relative peacefulness is one of them. Choose my words really carefully here. I use the word relative peacefulness because I think based on the thoughtfulness of the people in this room, you'll be aware of how Canada has not been peaceful in so many ways, and how Canada's present day and history has not been peaceful. Nonetheless, in terms of global perspective, in terms of the level of violence today, this is the Global Peace Index. This is published annually from the Institute of Economics and Peace. This means no data. I'm scared about this.
Have you touched the blue? See the little blue
Yeah.
panel? Don't touch that.
Don't touch that.
Yeah.
Okay. The dark, very dark green, almost black, is the most peaceful countries by the indices used by the Institute of Economics and Peace. And you'll see that Canada, New Zealand, Ireland, Iceland, is amongst a handful with Portugal there of the most peaceful countries. So, and 2 days ago was only the 4th time, we did have a more informal day called Orange Shirt Day, and 2 days ago was our 4th Truth and Reconciliation Day. So as I mentioned, Canada's relative peacefulness, I cannot ignore the fact that to this day and prior, Canada has had a history that has not been peaceful, and it's not right for me to describe it as peaceful without mentioning that. That's a theme that I'll come back to. So maybe a theme to just mention. Every simple rubric that we have for the world is probably wrong. I feel like we live in really difficult times, and we have these simple rubrics, and that's a problem for us. But let's talk about what I'm going to call perspective. So one of my colleagues got me to take that photograph in 2017. That's a bunker number 4 in the compound that I lived in Yemen, and that's where we're supposed to go if the airstrikes landed on us. And you can see there I'm wearing a T-shirt that says "Not a Target." That's a sort of campaign that Médecins Sans Frontières and others had launched with the plea to stop harming humanitarian workers and civilians. That campaign sort of born out of frustration after the Kunduz hospital bombings, and you'll see a sticker on the back of my laptop saying "Stop bombing hospitals." It's a theme in my work is advocating for protection of civilians and individuals. Here's me 2 years later sitting in a nice fancy office that you might recognise, James. This is the boardroom of Grand Challenges Canada. When I was back here, back in Yemen, I used to get R&R, and I came to Toronto. I had a job interview with Grand Challenges Canada. When I was on R&R, and the job interview took place in that room. That room like this has floor-to-ceiling glass windows and a lovely view of the city. The office I had in Yemen was quite different from that. We had metal shutters on the tiny windows so that blasts didn't get us. And I remember the person that gave me the job interview taking a little break and just standing and looking out the window going, "Oh man, how nice it must be to work in a place that, you know, you're not scared that the windows might injure you from sort of blast situation. So I appreciate Canada's peacefulness. I'm going to speak about some challenges and some bad things, but let's celebrate some good things. The Ottawa Treaty on landmines, I mean, it's not entirely Canada's doing. It was a global effort. The Canadians played quite an important role, you know, in you know, the late 90s, making sure that most of the world, not all of the world, but most of the world committed to not having landmines. Great moment in history. Kofi Annan described the Montreal Protocol to protect the ozone layer as perhaps the most successful international agreement to date. And I was fact-checking other quotes that I was going to use in the way here. They didn't stand up to my fact-checking, but other people had said, and maybe it was true at the time, that it was the only protocol that every nation had signed on to. There's not many things we all managed to agree upon. It's interesting. I hear some people go, oh, you got us all hyped up about the ozone layer, and you got us all hyped up about Y2K. These were not moments in history where people got people hyped up without good reason. It's issues in history where people collaborated to solve a problem, and that's why we look at it like that today. So it's not the only protocol that everybody signed, but it's one of very few. But it's one of the best ones because it's enforceable and it works. And you can see how the collective action there made progress. And of course that happened in that was signed in Montreal, right? And why was it signed in Montreal? I read into this. It's difficult to summarize it quickly. Canada was perceived as a leader in environmentalism at that point. Canada was perceived as a nation that would be an appropriate place to have such a conference. Canada has had, you could decide, a reputation for being a leader in this space. Some other highlights. I don't know how many of you have heard of John Peters Humphreys. He was the first boss of the United Nations Division on Human Rights. He was the primary author of the document that we know today as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Other people contributed to it. He did a first draft. He's a Canadian, you know. Canada did some great things then. Lester B. Pearson. You know, United Nations peacekeeping is a complicated thing. I think of contemporary conflicts. I don't see anybody calling for a UN peacekeeping intervention. No matter where people are on the political spectrum, it doesn't seem to be what they call for, and we know that it's a flawed mechanism, and Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire's experiences in Rwanda would be, you know, the most compelling example, and I don't need to say any more about that. But when it was first dreamed up, it was Lester B. Pearson that really brought this to the United Nations, and a peacekeeping force of a different, you know, set of rules was a key component in solving the Suez crisis, and that won Lester B. Pearson the Nobel Peace Prize. He's the only Canadian to have won the Nobel Peace Prize. We do have somebody in the room that did a Nobel Peace Prize speech, and when you accepted the prize on behalf of Doctors Without Borders, so we got somebody close in the room, but Lester's the only one that got his name on a certificate. The same year that Lester Pearson got that, the Pugwash Conference on Science and World Affairs was launched. I wonder how many of you know that. I didn't know much about it. I looked into it. It's the only Canadian organisation to win the Nobel Peace Prize. It was set up after a manifesto that Einstein and 10 other scientists signed about warning the world of the danger of nuclear weapons. And that manifesto called for a forum where people would come to discuss nuclear disarmament and the threats of nuclear war. A forum that would be occupied by scientists and civilians, and that's what, you know, is known as Track 2 diplomacy. Track 1 diplomacy is governments meeting each other. Track 2 is civil society meeting each other, and frequently this organisation organises conferences and does to this day. And the first conference was held in Pugwash, which is a tiny village in Nova Scotia, and a village I think of 400 at the time. And that was a philanthropist. You know, back in the day, philanthropists were funding peace endeavours. And if there's any listening online, hi. Pugwash was funded by a philanthropist that believed in promoting peace. And then he read that manifesto and he offered to host it there. And that's where the first one happened, and they happened all around the world. In 1969, Pierre Trudeau announced the end of the collaboration with the United States on nuclear weapons. And 3 years later, they returned to the United States. And so there's been some fantastic moments that I think have defined Canada, that Canada has this identity based, I think, on some of these things. In 2018, after Bob Rae returned from Myanmar, Canada was amongst the first nations to declare what was happening in Myanmar as a genocide. I think at this moment in time, Rohingya people are not satisfied with Canada's advocacy and response there, but there was a belief at that moment that Canada was doing something good to at least name the thing. So some great moments in Canadian history, and I think it in many ways defines Canadian identity. And today, Canada is peaceful, but most of the indicators that we might use to measure peace are going in a negative direction. And this was a difficult set of slides to put together because you're going to give some examples and you can't cover every single one. You can see that anti-Palestinian Islamic racism is up. Anti-Asian hate, has been a strong rising factor since the start of the pandemic. We've seen anti-Semitism. We've seen hate crimes. This is just the police reported ones, by the way. The police, it has quite a narrow definition. What makes it to the police. So I see you're trying to take photographs there, James, and I feel like I may have gone over the last slide a little bit too quickly.
Don't worry.
But anti-Semitism is on the rise. Both events in Palestine and COVID are cited as factors that have resulted in numerous different hate crimes going up. This is just the ones that are reported to police, right? So we all know that that's a minority. And it's only the ones that would fall in a definition of a hate crime, which is actually quite narrow. You see other there, for example, that's hate crimes based on people's gender identity, but that's on the rise as well. Polarization, I mean, this is actually about perceptions of polarization. It's difficult to measure polarization, but polarization is on the rise. And a significant percentage of young people think that the political stability of our country is threatened by polarization, and I agree with them. I was asked today to speak about humanitarianism. I looked last night at UNICEF's top emergencies. It's getting more difficult to assess this, but I don't know if you're familiar with the system that United Nations OCHA, Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, uses to define emergencies. Level 1, a local emergency, level 2, some international help needed, level 3 is the highest level of emergency. UNICEF published their 3 emergencies and they updated that list yesterday. Lebanon appeared on it. You can see that Haiti is not in a state of war, but gang violence and disorder is widely reported just now. Mpox is happening in both peaceful and post-conflict and conflict-affected countries. Nonetheless, you can clearly see that UNICEF's main priorities are very much driven by conflict or occurring in places that are affected by conflict or armed violence. This is the World Health Organization's top emergencies as of last night. I was going to try and categorize them, and I didn't. In the end, I just decided to put the list on the screen. But anybody who's following humanitarian affairs can see there's a very clear theme of conflict in how they define their top emergencies. Disease outbreaks don't have to happen in conflict. There's lots of humanitarian responses that are not conflict-driven. Disease outbreak, natural disaster. Nonetheless, what's concerning the WHO the most? Clearly, places that are affected by conflict. This is from the annual report that OCHA, the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, publish. They do it every year. There's a lot of things I could take out of this report. A lot of them would echo what I'm going to say elsewhere. I found this statistic quite concerning. 1 out of 5 children right now is fleeing from or living in conflict. The number of people affected by humanitarian crisis is, by the way, the highest it's ever been. The number of people forcibly displaced is the highest it's ever been. I came to Canada in 2010 just to do a little bit of work on a Doctors Without Borders public education campaign. It was called Refugee Camp in the Heart of the City. They gave me a T-shirt and I had the number 42 on the back because we were shocked that there was 42 million people displaced by conflict. And we were shocked because the year before it was 38, 42 million. At this point exceeded 100 million when it surpassed 1% of the world is forcibly displaced. At this moment in time, 1 in 73 people, the entire world is forcibly displaced. I looked at MSF's annual report last night, I didn't have to look far. This is the first paragraph, by the way. This is the introductory note to it. Conflict is the first word on it. So how does war affect humanitarianism? It's like the main thing, along with climate and COVID that I mentioned. This has been a bit of a one-way communication so far. Are there any questions? Well, I'll give you time for questions at the end. Let's keep going. Perspective. Always interested, you know, people can say words, but you can sort of measure sometimes what really matters by how much money we spend on stuff. It's a theme that I got from you. I think you first spoke about how much money we spent on humanitarianism versus military. You know, I sometimes compare it to how much we spend. We spend more on humanitarian response than we do on chewing gum as a world. You know, sorry, less than we do on chewing gum. We spend less than we do on humanitarian affairs as we do on ice cream. You know, I suspect this room cares a lot about humanitarian response, but as a world, you know, you can see what our perspectives are about what we spend on it. Don't take it from me. Let's take it from Joe Biden. Don't tell me what you value. Show your budget, and I'll tell you what you value. So let's do that. That little box down there is how much we spent on humanitarian aid, and that much here is how much we spent on military. So, as a world, that's what we value. Of that 2,400 billion, less than 1% gets spent on peacekeeping and peace building. I've got to say, I'm not entirely sure what military is defined as peacekeeping and peace building is the same as what I define as peacekeeping and peace building. But let's just leave that there. But you know, government spent 26 billion on humanitarian aid, and it's a fraction of what we spend on military. Let's narrow it down. Let's look at the United States. They are the largest spender on military. How much did they spend on military? Almost $1 trillion. That's 900 billion. And they have a Peace Corps operation. You know, that was set up to advance peace. It takes quite a holistic view of what peace might mean. You know, it's a lot of it. You might think of humanitarian aid and things like that, but it's all positive. They spent, you know, $500 million on that, and I looked at their map of operations, and none of it was happening where the conflicts are. So that's, you know, that's a comparison there. I know that many of you that attended this class got 4 or 5 emails from Dr. James saying, you know, this is some pre-reading. So I scanned that, but man, you had quite a long reading list. I hope you guys have good caffeine intake or sleeping habits better than mine. So I decided not to sort of replicate, you know, anything that I saw in here, but maybe to try and complement it. International humanitarian law, you know, like, it's kind of fancy jargon for me for don't kill civilians. You know, that's the key thing that I take away from international humanitarian law. I don't sort of advocate for international humanitarian law because I'm really driven by law and justice, but it's just because that's like the sort of legal argument to say, please don't kill civilians, you know. So I just wanted to, you know, do that. I mentioned Kunduz, the hospital bombing that United States government did against my colleagues and our patients in 2015. You know, the Kunduz hospital was struck 4 times over the period of an hour. And that was, for me, a sort of defining moment in my humanitarian career. And it was very interesting. Those of us that have done international work, you get security training, you know, and when we got security training, you know, back in the day, it was all about imagining protecting yourself against what people call non-state actors. You know, that's like the neutral jargon for rebels or freedom fighters or terrorists or whatnot. You know, that was who we assumed would be the people that would harm us, and maybe that was true back then, but it's not true. It's not true nowadays. It's states, it's governments, it's members of the United Nations Security Council that did this. There's a database that you can go online. It's called the Aid Worker Security Database. They publish it every year. And when I do my class at University of Toronto, I go to that every year, and I tell people about the trends, you know, and you know, for a few years it seemed like maybe things were getting better, you know, like when I started teaching, it was clearly getting worse, you know, and events in Syria really drove that, you know, not to mention events in Yemen, South Sudan, and North Nigeria, and other places that affected it. Last year was the worst year on record. And the deaths of humanitarian workers in Gaza, just in the past few months of the year, surpassed many other years put together. So it's always, you know, uncomfortable, you know, saying, "Oh, don't kill aid workers," you know, because the death toll of civilians is, of course, magnificently higher than this. But actually, it's not two separate topics, because this is mostly local host community. You know, this is civilians. Most of the people who died in Gaza are from Gaza. You know, I'm standing in front of you as a aid worker who's got Scottish and Canadian identity. I'm not the norm. The vast majority of aid workers are local population, and that's particularly true in Gaza. So, important to recognise that. It's the same, another graphic from the same document, which is a snapshot of last year's figures. So you can go to Aid Worker Security Database and you can look at what's harming humanitarians and where, and you can see the trends. I'll start. So, difficult in this complicated world to know what to spend your time on and what to focus on if you want to make a better world. You know, do you focus on climate or peace or humanitarianism or universal basic income? You know, what is it? I'm going to start to explain that they're quite deeply connected. One of my favourite books, How Bad Are Bananas? If I thought about this, I'd have got the latest edition. How Bad Are Bananas is quite a fun book. It starts about the carbon cost of using a dishwasher, carbon cost of an email, carbon cost of drying your hands with a dryer or a paper towel, and you quickly realise that none of that makes any difference. It's all rearranging the chairs on the desktop, on the deck of the Titanic. Towards the end of the book, you start to get to what really makes a difference, and these I've not sort of selectively chosen them. These are in order as it appears. The carbon, and it's carbon dioxide equivalent. You know, let's not get too caught up in the chemistry, but they start at the start. You know, a good way to measure the environmental impact of things is the carbon dioxide equivalent put out by things. The national output of Malawi, and this is all a few years old, so this was true a few years ago, but I think the sense of perspective will remain true. Malawi's national footprint: 1.2 million tons of carbon dioxide. One volcano eruption, 42 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent gets put into the atmosphere. A World Cup, 3 million tons. The forest fire season for the whole of California in 2008, 231 million tons. All of the world's data centers put together. I can tell that I've typed that wrong there. So we'll see if we can correct that in real time. But we won't correct that in real time. I'll say that obviously made a typo when I wrote that there. The Iraq War cost 250 to 600 million tons, which is about the same as the national output of Australia. So war is terribly bad for the environment. We've already demonstrated at the start that it's really bad for people, you know, and if you were to average the last 2 years from Uppsala, you'd see about 300,000 people are dying a year from war. It's really bad environmentally. How expensive is war? I thought I might not be able to measure this, but actually the same people that did that map of the world and the peacefulness actually did fairly recently. And the economic impact of all of this cost is magnificent. It's $14.4 trillion. 10% of the world's gross domestic product. It's costing us $2,000 a person for everybody in the world. And you know, if you want to read about, you know, how people profit from war, you know, you'll end up speaking about politicians gaining power and weapons companies making profits. And then at a local level, you can read about how I found this Chatham House document when I was in Yemen to be quite powerful, speaking about how people can make small profits from taxing and things like that. Not everybody's against war, you know, people can make money from war, but most people are fundamentally against war. But war is particularly, so it's costly in terms of killing people, obviously. It's costly in terms of the environment, and it's economically massively costly. Let's try to summarize what we've covered so far. War is on the rise, and it's a key driver of humanitarianism, and it also blocks aid. So it's both a cause and a cause of humanitarian issues, and it's blocking humanitarian issues. War is killing huge numbers of people. It's having a huge negative impact on the environment in terms of carbon output. It's having a huge economic cost to the world, and that's in the context of a climate emergency. And locally, I've already explained that trends are rising, hatred is rising, polarization is rising. And I just want to say these numbers, they're underestimates.
Just keep that in the time.
Noting the time, I'll speed up a little bit. I heard 2 stories of people not being able to access insulin due to conflict. And that's not probably captured in these numbers. The interruptions to the medical supply chain. So gender equity, the Lancet Commission on Peaceful Societies, and I'll show you the citation for that, shows that gender equity and health equity is not just a consequence of peace, but a driver of peace. Conflict is caused by climate change and drives climate change. It causes humanitarian aid needs and it blocks them. These topics are not separate. So we live in a complicated world, and we try to make sense of it through simple narratives, and we find ourselves with black and white thinking and oversimplistic narratives for the world. Politicians can gain power from launching wars, and there's scientific evidence to the academic citations for that here. And hatred is used by politicians to hype people up and to distract them from the real social issues of the day. And LGBTQ 2+ community is feeling that just now, both here and internationally. We think it's important to promote peace and truth. Truth is the first part of truth and reconciliation. Reconciliation happens after truth. And we think there's a huge advantage to doing so locally. Here we are in Toronto having this conversation. These conversations I find often happen in urban centres and academic centres, but they need to happen throughout Canada. And I'm going to speak to you about some of the advantages and how we want to promote peace and why we want to do it in a rural situation. And I spoke at the start about that book that Professor Wim quoted by the peace writer called Houston Wood, and he speaks about positive peace and negative peace. Positive peace, well, negative peace is the absence of something. It's the absence of fear, it's the absence of violence, it's the absence of war. Positive peace is all the other things that advance peace in society: health, democracy, equality, thriving social systems. Peace is a consequence of truth and reconciliation. Peace is influenced by art, by advocacy and activism. It's important as we promote peace that we don't leave people feeling disempowered. That would be a great success for people who favour war. We need to promote peace in a way that makes people realise that their choices can influence peace, both locally and internationally. Communities are being fractured, but we want community cohesion, and planetary health is inseparable from this topic. There are peace museums in many parts of the world. Toronto did recently open the Asia Pacific Peace Museum, and that's fantastic. We don't have a national peace museum, which is quite interesting considering how much we consider our national identity in Canada to be about peace. The United States has a peace museum. I was recently in the peace museum in the UK, but Canada doesn't have one. I find that very interesting. Let's say that I persuaded you that we should promote peace. I feel like I might have. We live in times where trust in institutions is at an all-time low. Trust in the media is at an all-time low. This is a study done by the Canadian Museums Association that shows that trust in newspapers and trust in television news is less than 50%. Trust in healthcare providers remains high. Trust in academia remains high. The trust in museums remains high as long as things are done well. We want to open a Canadian Peace Museum that is rural. That makes it deeply affordable. But rural Canada is more important than it ever was. We always speak about urbanization in forums like this. Canada ruralized during the pandemic. More people went rural. This urbanization trend was bucked a bit during the pandemic. Rural Canada yet still needs economic development and lacks institutions. We want to do this in a way that avoids simplicity. You can't deal with these issues through memes and tweets and 1-second sound bites and having arguments and Facebook comments. It needs nuance and care and careful conversations. We can't silo these issues. And we need to promote peace in a way that doesn't fracture society anymore. A lot of conversations around these topics have been done in a way that has actually added to fracturing of society, and we wish to reverse that. There's all sorts of fractures, including a rural-urban fracture, and we want to help people along the journey to understand these things and not sow more discord in society. We want to be humble. Canadian Museum for Human Rights is a lovely, magnificent building. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars. I love it. What better to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on than a museum for human rights? But that's not where we're going to start. We're going to start or rent a store, or if we can buy a small store and do that. The peace museums I've cited in the UK and the United States, they're small, humble ones that in an old office and an old store. We do need bricks and mortars. Museums are physical places and they have artifacts, and I'll speak about the artifacts that we have and that we have incoming. But online is also important. And we want to move around and show the artifacts we have in different parts of Canada. Let's talk about the artifacts, because peace seems kind of abstract. And so I want to talk about some of the artifacts that we've had promised. I'm going to start with one that's very much an artifact of war. And that's not what a peace museum is. It's not a mini war museum, but you can't tell the story of peace without the story of war. We've signed an MOU with the White Helmets to donate 2 ambulances that are affected by conflict. You'll see a story arc that does end in peace here. This opens up a very interesting conversation about what is contemporary conflict. It's violence, of course, but it's misinformation, and misinformation is a key feature of contemporary conflict. The attack on these ambulances was denied by the perpetrators. And so this starts a story arc of violence and attempts to minimize violence. This is an airstrike warning system. The Smithsonian Museum got the jump on us here, and they are exhibiting this just now, but we'll be the second museum in the world to show HAL Systems airstrike warning system, which reduces the lethality of airstrikes by a significant degree. And sticking with Syria, I wonder if you've seen the dramatization of Tariq had and his family's chocolate company that came to Canada just over 6 years ago. Chocolatiers escaping Damascus after the factory was bombed, and now they have one of Canada's biggest confectionery companies and frankly the best chocolate that I've had in Canada. And that's the original factory that the local community bought for them. It features in the video, and they wish to lend this to us and speak about helping people affected by conflict. In my hand here, I have one of 1,000 profiles that peace women across the globe made in 2005 when they nominated 1,000 women for the Peace Prize. The Peace Prize was started in 1901. Over 100 men have won it since then, and 19 women have won it. Doesn't accurately represent the magnitude of peace-related work that women do in this world. And so there's a gender inequity issue even in the peace movement. And we have, all 1,000 of these on display. Canada Royal Mint and Canada Post are on board. They both have peace-related coins and postage stamps that they're going to lend or donate to us. James introduced me at the start. It's not just me. Sarah Wolf is on the board with me. Sarah's a first-generation survivor of the residential school system. She has an MBA. She's launched 7th-generation midwives in Toronto. She launched the Indigenous Innovation Initiative in Toronto as well. She joins me with Dr. Anita Ashok, the world's only female Rohingya neurosurgeon, and she has a lived experiences as well. James already identified himself as one of our board of advisors, but we have a rich team of advisors, including Glenn, who's a director of the Canadian War Museum, Robert Hunter, who's the elected representative of the local First Nation, the Kishiku, Manitou, Madaskarini First Nation, which is the local First Nation So Bancroft, prior to launching the Peace Museum, we write about peace, and we're doing activities already that promote peace. We ran the Stories of Peace Award. You saw last year's winning entry at the start there. Here's this year's winning art. There's some news coverage of our Stories of Peace Award. I'm going fast because I've already been warned about the time and I want to leave space for questions.
You got 2 minutes there.
I'll get 2 minutes. We installed a peace pole in Bancroft Cenotaph Park ahead of International Peace Day. We managed to get some momentum on this. We're provoking conversations from newspaper columnists. We're making the news ourselves as an institution. I'm even getting to appear on the news speaking about peace-related matters. We've got the local municipal government support, quite enthusiastic support. You see a letter of support. You see them paying for the peace pole. Olivia Chow, at a request, proclaimed the 21st of September as International Peace Day in Toronto, and they illuminated the Toronto sign for the day. Niagara Falls also lit up at our request, and so did the CN Tower. We had a little event in the Peace Garden in Nathan Phillips Square. Yes, Nathan Phillips Square has a Peace Garden. You might not have noticed it. It's the most badly signed Peace Garden I've ever seen, and you can read my rants in Toronto Star about that. We've got good support. UNHCR have lent us a photo exhibit. The Culture Days in Ontario had us do an event in Toronto on Saturday there. The public support this enthusiastically. 7% of Canadians said they would come to Bancroft. 2.5 million people over 5 years said they would come to Bancroft. People believe that peace is a key value. You want to know an uplifting fact? 69% of Canadians thought it was important to learn about the good things we've done in history. And 75 thought we should learn from our mistakes. I found that quite uplifting. We're a member of a number of museum associations that are all helping us along the journey here. We're being invited to speak at various events. We thank the community in the town of Bancroft for their support. Today, I'm delighted to say for the first time to announce Power Corporation of Canada has given us a very generous gift, and that will allow us to fund startup costs to get this off the ground. We are grateful for the support that people have given us so far. This is a game changer for us, and it'll be exceptionally helpful to get this off the ground. And that is the end of my busy slide presentation, and now is an opportunity for you to ask me questions and for James to not panic that I'm going to go over time.
Thanks very much. I'm sure I put it right up. Thoughts, comments, reflections? Got to be some thoughts. Go ahead.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the Stories of Peace competition and sort of how that came about.
And before you answer, others? Go ahead.
You've given us very good contemporary empirical evidence concerning war, which doesn't, I put it to you, deviate from the historical empirical evidence. So it seems to me that it's innate, a human disposition to war. However, none of us woke up this morning thinking that we are going to go to war. So war requires leadership. I would like you to comment, reconcile this gap between daily disposition and the, perhaps one would say, political appetite for.
Any other thoughts, comments? Go ahead. Nice and loud. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just curious to know whether you had thought of potentially doing a virtual museum first prior to a physical museum, just because it's more accessible, but also we've caught up with technology, we have augmented reality that allows for that.
Okay.
It might be, I don't know, a bit of a bigger question.
A little bit louder if you don't mind.
Yeah, it might be a bigger question than we have time here, and I know it's also a bit sensitive issues, but I was just thinking about the role of memory for peace and how having a peace museum is important for that. And what you mentioned about it not being, a peace museum can be, it's not a war museum, but it also has to acknowledge war in order to talk about peace. And I was thinking about that with a kind of a maybe broader interpretation of war and state perpetuated violence in terms of recognizing Canada's history with Indigenous genocide and the diaspora of enslaved African peoples, and not only these violence, if you consider peace maybe as a response for violence and not war specifically necessarily only, but also the ongoing involvement of Canada in economically supporting these conflicts and how to find that balance when curating the museum. And
Okay, let's give Chris a chance to reply. Over to you, Chris.
So the stories of peace is I think connected to the virtual question that you have, because that is an example of an activity that we can do prior to museum launching. We do believe that we should have a physical premises for credibility purposes, and because we have some powerful artifacts, but the online thing is exceptionally important, and that's what you see with the writing and the stories of peace is an example of promoting peace. The reason for the stories of peace competition is to provoke conversations around peace, and that's our motivation to do so. The disposition towards violence, that was what I thought a lot about earlier in this journey, but I have learned and I have seen scholars speak to the normalcy of peacefulness, and what I hear when I speak to Professor Wim, who I know was in the meeting, was that conflict is normal, disagreement is normal. Humans are consistently finding themselves with disagreement, but the act of responding to with violence is not normal, and it has never been normal, and it's always abnormal. Even though war has been a feature in contemporary society, at any moment in time, most countries are at peace. Most people are at peace, and most people in the countries affected by war desire peace as well. I think what we see is that leadership, use violence and war as a response to things for a whole bunch of reasons that are not sensible. I heard somebody describe it as a failure of imagination, to think of violence as the natural response to that. And there's a lot more I can say about that, but there's a time limit here, and I would love to continue that. And there's a fourth question about Canada's role and the complexity of that, and truth and reconciliation, and how important that has to be. A lot of what we've spoken about has just been the past, few decades, and not the 15,000 years that precedes that of Canada's history, which is 15,000 years of people making peace and collaborating together. The thing about this, the reason we're saying they needed a museum and not a Facebook page is because all of these questions require so much nuance and care that I can't answer them in this moment adequately, and every one of these issues requires so much care. I can only say to you that everything that you're asking about is on the table and informs how we do this. And if I had more time, I would have delved into the richness of the people behind us and spoke about the complexity and the inclusiveness of the process to make sure that we make decisions correct about that. But every one of the many points you made there is quite important and very much at the front of our mind. And at 1 minute towards the hour, I probably need to leave it there and see if there's questions online or James has any closing comments.
Other thoughts or comments by those who haven't yet?
We do have someone.
Oh, go ahead, Sanjay, very briefly, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
Sanjay?
it'll be very brief. In their presentation to the International Criminal Court, the South African delegation, as one of their main legal representatives from Ireland, said that this was the Gaza conflict was the first one where people were live streaming their own imminent deaths. And so the spread of this content poses some challenges psychologically for people to engage with peace potentially. Do you have any thoughts on that, Chris?
Many thoughts, but what to say about such a heavy issue to do it justice. What can I say? It's the thoughts on the very specific matter of people documenting what's happening around them.
Yeah, but also how we respond to that here when we're in a state of peace locally, and how the lack of peace elsewhere can maybe distract us from engaging in something like the Peace Museum process, and whether you're seeing the Peace Museum as kind of an antidote to get people out of the live streamed world into the active state.
I wouldn't want to do anything that would distract people or give less attention to the importance of trying to find a peaceful solution there. I have so many thoughts and so much to say. And never in my life before had I felt that calling for a ceasefire or for peace was something that would be called into question as anything but the right thing to do. But as you know, Sanjay, it's such a big topic that I don't know where to begin. I don't like to share spontaneous thoughts about such a heavy issue, but like I see the desire to promote peace as something that will help Canadians, and I hope encourage Canadians to call for peace in Gaza and in other contexts. And it shouldn't be politically problematic to call for an end to violence. It should be normal, and I hope that we advance that, and I hope that we do nothing to stop other activities to bring peace in Gaza and Sudan and every one of the dozens of countries that I've mentioned. And forgive me for not getting into more detail, but we're 2 minutes over. But it's such an important point, and I thank you for raising it, and I hope I've given some meaningful answer to such an important question. Despite the
no, you did. No, thank you. And also just full disclosure, Chris and I are working on some projects together, and so lovely to hear your talk, and James, your moderation. And thanks to just lovely to see everyone in the room concerned about this issue as well. Very heartening.
Thank you. Well, let me just make one or two very brief comments before we close. Thank you, first of all, Chris, for making the effort to link war, humanitarianism, and peace in all of its complexity. And I think you've actually been able to do that, or at least give us a window into that complexity. And thank you for not leaping to simplistic, sloganistic answers. And thank you for at least beginning to define the question before leaping to answers. One of the great challenges that we face in this post-Enlightenment, postmodern world is that, at least in my view, we have far too many answers, and we've forgotten what the questions are. And we leap to answers, to solutions, to technical responses, and all of which is magnified by what is now a fundamental element of our human culture, which is digital systems. Digital systems of thinking now. It's not just tools. This is how we actually think. And this, I think, is a challenge. And it's a particular challenge when we're trying to understand the complexity of relationship between war, humanitarianism, and peace. And as I said, I think you've done a very nice job in illuminating for us. And then the final thing that I would like to say is that one of the slides talked about positive peace as opposed to negative peace. Negative peace being the absence of war. And the counterbalance to that was positive peace, which is, if I can recall, it's creating, enabling the forms, structures, and cultures and institutions that allow us not to avoid conflict. Because by definition, I live in conflict in my own head, but by definition, when I'm sitting with another human being, one other human being, or two, or three, or four, we are going to have differences. We are going to have conflict. And there's many kind of dimensions to that, many things that accelerate the possibility of conflict. Many things, which, you know, I'm sure we could spend most of the afternoon just making a list of those things. But the difference between conflict, between seeking common solutions versus using violence to impose a solution, is about our culture of peace, a culture which by definition means we will work together to resolve or to put in a position of détente issues of conflict. We will create institutions that allow us to do that. And I again want to thank you, Chris, for highlighting that as one of your key points. And I think it's the point that I would like to end on. Again, I just want to thank you for the seminar. Thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting us. You know, I really appreciate getting this space to come and speak about these issues and having such thoughtful questions on it. You know, it's some heavy issues. So I appreciate the space you've given us today and for broadcasting it and for the support that each of you have given us. And thanks.
And I see you've got a monthly donor now, which from the comics. So that's
there you go.
So that's good.
It's a volunteer run, and it's all possible thanks to a lot of donations from a lot of people, and I think that's Rebecca mentioned that, and thank you, Rebecca, for your donation. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much, Chris. We're going to return, next week, same time, same place, and our